it's Angelo, and welcome to my Discipline Priest guide for patch 7.3.2 and patch 7.3.5 in Antorus, the Burning Throne for World of Warcraft Legion. Now, compared to previous patches, there have been a few changes made for the Discipline Priest's playstyle, which become pretty clear when looking at current go-to talent builds. But all in all, the Disc Priest has remained faithful to its essential playstyle rework that came with Legion. Dealing damage in order to heal is still the most unique and important aspect of the spec, but the weight has shifted towards making things less complicated and more competitive in different niches of healing in order for the Discipline Priest to enjoy more playtime. The Disc Priest is most certainly a viable and fun to play spec and is actually able to dish out some serious healing in both single target and group healing environments while also dealing a considerable amount of damage. Now in this guide, similar to my previous ones, we'll go over the stat priority you will want to be going for, your talents, your rotation, and of course the overall pros and cons we're facing this patch. As always, without any further ado of course though, let's go right ahead and have a look. Now as always, starting us off is the stat priority. When looking at our stats, no big changes come to the Discipline Priest really, apart from Intellect being our most valuable stat now, placing Haste second. This effectively though won't have too big of an impact on your prioritization of gear, because Intellect is found on pretty much every item you will use, except for rings, necklaces, and some trinkets. Haste is strong mainly because it reduces your cooldowns and on top of that, allows for your Purge of the Wicked or Shadow Word Pain to tick more often in its uptime, and allows for your Penance to channel its bolts quicker. It also ties in well with your Mindbender and Shield Discipline talents quite neatly, as it allows Mindbender to hit more often, and since it reduces Power Word Shield's cooldown, which effectively refunds more mana, this makes great use of Shield Discipline as well. Critical Strike, as stated on the screen, improves the effectiveness of your spells, so damage and healing, while Mastery increases the healing you do via Atonement by a percentual amount. Both Critical Strike and Mastery can be considered to flat out buff your overall output, and the two are almost on par when it comes to their potency for you, with Critical Strike pulling slightly ahead. Versatility is a simple damage, healing, and survivability buff, but it's a very expensive stat, giving little in return for the amount of stat required to make it worth your time. When discussing our talents, not much has really changed since patch 7.2.5, or rather since the Tomb of Sargeras. Twist of Fate will still be your go-to talent during progression, while Castigation is nonetheless incredibly strong and should be used in accordance with your legendary ring, the Soul of the High Priest, or for fights that will typically not see your targets drop below 35% health very often. In your level 30 row, Angelic Feather does prove to have the most utility for you and your group, but Body and Soul, for example, can be strong when you'd have to support a tank or any other player moving across the room, for example, but in all fairness, this can be a little unreliable due to Power Word Shield having no charges and being on a cooldown, unless using Rapture. Your level 45 talents are completely up to you honestly. I personally recommend Shining Force, as I think it proves the most utility for you, while Psychic Voice would come in second. Your level 60 talent tier will look more interesting now. Shield Discipline proves to refund more mana than Mindbender, yet essentially requires Power Word Shield to be held on a cooldown in order to get the most out of the talent. Mindbender, on the other hand, is incredibly convenient to use, as it's on a 1-minute cooldown and does not require constant attention from you in order to utilize it. When looking at the damage output, Mindbender will pull ahead, offering more damage and solid mana refunding, but for fights where you find yourself struggling with mana, you should go for Shield Discipline. For your level 75 tier, only two choices really come into play. Sanctuary increases Smite's passive absorption effect by 50%, which proves to be a pretty formidable increase to your overall healing output. Clarity of Will can prove to be strong, but in comparison to Sanctuary it suffers a little bit, making it the weaker choice of the tier, or rather of the two. In your level 90 tier, Purge the Wicked wins out in comparison to Divine Star and Halo. Now, Halo can be pretty strong if there's a lot of damage coming in and if there are a lot of adds in a given encounter. Most of the time though, this won't be the case, so Purge of the Wicked should be your go-to talent in this row. In our final row, we have Evangelism, and this one proves to be our strongest choice. Evangelism is a relatively new talent and extends the duration of your currently active atonements on all targets by 6 seconds. This allows you to get some atonements going on more than just 5 targets pretty easily, while being able to maintain them for a longer period of time. Hands down your best option for raiding, and should be taken pretty much all of the time. Grace is incredibly strong in Mythic Plus because Evangelism isn't really needed here, and Grace flat out buffs your healing output pretty neatly. All in all, the highlighted talent set will be the one you will be using mostly, with the exceptions I've just mentioned taking place in various different scenarios. When looking at your regular rotation, keep in mind that healers don't really go by a set order of spells that will be your best ones in any or all situations. Instead, there's more of a priority-styled list or gameplay involved most of the time. Now, the Discipline Priest is incredibly unique here because the spec is able to combine both of these aspects into one, maintaining a simple yet important DPS rotation while also juggling certain healing priorities in a fight. To start off a fight, you'll want to apply your atonement to a few targets preemptively, so it's best going off of a pull timer and just apply a few ticks to the tanks or the DPS if there's any damage coming in early. Shadow Word Pain and or Purge the Wicked if talented should also be used right from the start, and you'll want to upkeep the dot on as many targets as possible. If you have Mindbender Spect, you'll want to roll it out on cooldown as well in order to gain the most damage output from it and to keep your mana pool healthy right from the start. If Mindbender is not spec'd, needless to say that Power Word Shield should be applied immediately and should be held on cooldown as well. Penance should be used either whenever it's ready, or whenever you can predict that there's some damage coming within the next few seconds, similarly to Power Word Radiance, and it needs to be used in a predictable manner, both of these, in order for you to immediately compensate incoming group damage accordingly. Power Word Radiance is limited to 2 charges now though, so using each charge wisely does require your attention. Now, if there's hard damage coming in form of direct damage, for example to your tank, you won't really be able to compensate that incoming damage with your atonement only, which means you'll need to work with Shadow Mend instead. Shadow Mend will also put atonement onto your healed target, which means once the situation is under control again, you can revert back to your regular priorities or your DPS rotation. Now, when looking at said DPS rotation, you'll want to, again, use Penance mostly on cooldown, have Shadow Word Pain, or of course Purge the Wicked, applied to your targets, and then cast Smite consecutively. It's important to add that Smite will apply an absorption effect to the targeted enemy, which causes that enemy to actually deal less damage to its target, and because of this, you'll most certainly want to be using Smite in your spare time, or any time where the incoming raid or group damage allows you to do so. What we also need to discuss at this point are our cooldowns. All in all, the Disc Priest is limited in its large cooldowns, but has a magnitude of smaller ones at its disposal which support the spec's healing dynamic of short-termed, quick, bursty healing. First off, we have Rapture, which temporarily removes the cooldown of your Power Word Shield, allowing for a perfect setup for damage prevention or preventing a tricky situation to get even trickier. Pain Suppression, one of your rather strong cooldowns, reduces the target's damage taken by 40% for 8 seconds, so you want to be using this as an external cooldown, which will most likely be used on a tank. Evangelism, your talent, which we just recently discussed, can be considered a small cooldown, which as stated in the talent section, allows you to upkeep a lot of atonements on your targets. You'll most likely be using Evangelism right before a strong damage spike is incoming in order to properly spread your atonement and then counter the damage. Evangelism actually ties in quite well with Light's Wrath, your artifact ability, and Power Word Radiance. Light's Wrath can certainly be considered a cooldown due to its potential strength and 1.5 minute cooldown, and it deals 10% more damage to the target the more atonements you have spread, or rather for each atonement you have spread. This means that you'll want to hold on to Light's Wrath for incoming damage, prepare for it properly, and then have it work its magic as strongly as possible. Lastly, let's touch on Power Word Barrier. Fortunately, Power Word Barrier has very specific uses for us. It should be used whenever you have a stacked group or raid, as it reduces incoming damage by 25% for 10 seconds for all group members within the barrier. The Discipline Priest is definitely one of the most unique specs in the game due to its very diverse, slightly complex, and interesting playstyle. When it comes to healing, the disc is strongest if allowed to heal incoming damage right as it happens, or rather right after it happens, in bursty waves of healing, rather than slow-ticking, longer-lasting blanket heals. What the Discipline Priest lacks in utility to deal with incoming damage reactively, like most other healers do, the spec makes up for with the ability to prepare, set up, and ramp up a ridiculous amount of healing in a short amount of time, and for a short amount of time, if everything is done correctly. The disc is a healer that fulfills a great supportive role in a great healing setup and is able to shine when played well. In comparison to other healers, I would say that the spec requires a bit more attention, more skill arguably, and more knowledge than other classes and specs, which can make the Discipline Priest appear overwhelming to newcomers, but after getting the gist of it, believe me, it's not as hard as it may seem. On screen now, I'll give you a final little summary of everything important at your disposal, and sticking to these things should get you going pretty quickly. As always, if you have any suggestions, ideas, or anything you'd notice that I failed to mention in this guide, please be sure to let me know in the comments below. I have a few more Discipline Priest videos lined up where we dive deeper into the spec and all that it can and should do, just as we did for the Shadow Priest recently, so of course my friends, stay tuned for that. Now, as always, have a good one, and I will see you all in the next one.
A lifetime in repeat.